Welcome to a chapter a day. Most people spend their lives trying harder to succeed, trying harder to be liked, trying harder to make things happen. But there is something strange about how life actually works. The more desperately people want something, the more it seems to move away from them. Opportunities slip through their fingers. Confidence disappears at the exact moment it's needed. And the future they imagined always feels slightly out of reach. Now here's the surprising part. The people who consistently attract the opportunities, the success, the relationships, and the breakthroughs are rarely the ones chasing them the hardest. Instead, they operate on a completely different internal frequency. A quiet psychological state where they pursue their goals, but they are no longer emotionally dependent on them. They move forward with focus, but without desperation. They care about what they are building, but they do not need validation from the outcome. And the moment that shift happens, something powerful changes. Their decisions become clearer. Their energy becomes calmer. Their presence becomes stronger. And strangely, the very things they once chased begin moving toward them. Because life tends to respond not to how badly you want something, but to the identity you embody while pursuing it. So in this audiobook, we are going to explore something most people misunderstand completely. Why not caring in the right way becomes one of the most powerful forces for manifestation, confidence, and personal transformation. You will begin to see how desperation quietly blocks opportunity, how emotional independence creates magnetic presence, and why the moment you stop needing the outcome, you often become the person capable of achieving it. And once you truly understand this shift, you'll never chase life the same way again. Chapter 1. The Hidden Cost of Wanting Too Much. There is a moment that almost everyone has experienced. A moment when something suddenly feels extremely important. A job interview. A conversation that could change a relationship. An opportunity that feels like it might finally move life forward. And in that moment, something subtle begins to happen inside the mind. Your breathing changes slightly. Your thoughts speed up. Your attention narrows. And without realizing it, you begin to care just a little too much about the outcome. Now, on the surface, this seems logical. After all, if something matters, shouldn't you care deeply about it? But here is where life introduces one of its strange paradoxes. Because very often, the moment we care too much, our ability to perform, think clearly, and act naturally begins to weaken. The voice becomes less steady. Decisions become more hesitant. Ideas that once felt simple suddenly become complicated. And the opportunity that once felt exciting now feels fragile. If you pay close attention, you may recognize this pattern in your own life. Maybe it happened during an important conversation where you wanted someone to like you. Maybe it appeared when presenting an idea that mattered deeply to you. Or maybe it happened when you finally had the chance to pursue something you had been thinking about for years. Suddenly, instead of feeling calm and capable, you felt pressure. You felt tension. You felt the quiet weight of expectation pressing on every decision you made. And strangely, the harder you tried to make everything go perfectly, the more unnatural everything began to feel. This is the moment where many people unknowingly enter what could be called the pressure trap of desire. A state where the mind becomes so focused on achieving a specific result that it begins sabotaging the very behaviors that would make that result possible. And this brings us to an important phrase you will hear repeated throughout this audiobook, because it reveals a subtle truth about how the mind operates. The tighter you grip the outcome, the more fragile your state becomes. Think about that for a moment. The tighter you grip the outcome, the more fragile your state becomes. When you grip the outcome tightly, your emotional balance becomes tied to something outside your control. And the moment your emotional stability depends on something uncertain, your nervous system reacts. It interprets the situation as risk. It interprets the moment as something that could threaten your identity. Because deep beneath the surface of our conscious thoughts, the brain is constantly asking one quiet question. What does this mean about who I am? If the outcome feels neutral, the brain remains calm. But if the outcome feels like it determines your worth, your future, or your identity, the brain shifts into protection mode. Suddenly, the stakes feel higher. And when the stakes feel higher, the body releases stress hormones. Your heart rate increases. Your mind begins scanning for possible mistakes. Your attention becomes divided between the task itself and the fear of getting it wrong. This is why people often say things like, "I knew exactly what I wanted to say until the moment came to say it," or "I practiced perfectly, but when it mattered, everything felt different." The reason is rarely a lack of ability. More often, it is the invisible pressure created by emotional dependence on the outcome. When the outcome becomes too important, the mind loses the calm state required for natural performance. Now here is something interesting. If you observe people who appear confident in high-pressure situations, you may notice something unusual. They rarely appear desperate for the result. They care about what they are doing. They prepare. They show up fully. But their emotional state does not collapse if the outcome goes a different direction. They operate with what might be called emotional independence. And emotional independence creates something powerful. It creates calm. It creates clarity. It creates presence. Presence is one of the most underestimated forces in human behavior. When someone is fully present, their attention is not split between performing and worrying. Their mind is not constantly checking the future to see whether things are working out. Instead, their energy remains anchored in the moment itself. And because of that, their actions feel natural. Their words flow easily. Their decisions come from clarity rather than pressure. This is why calm people often appear more capable than anxious people, even when their skills are similar. Because the calm person is not fighting their own nervous system. They are working with it. But for most people, this calm state disappears the moment something feels extremely important. Why? Because the mind begins linking the outcome to identity. It begins quietly suggesting things like, if this works, it proves something about me. If this fails, it says something about me. And once that association forms, everything changes. The situation is no longer just an opportunity. It becomes a test of self-worth. And tests of self-worth create pressure. Pressure creates hesitation. Hesitation interrupts natural ability. And suddenly the very thing you wanted most begins slipping out of reach. This is why people often sabotage opportunities without understanding why. They prepare. They try. They want the result deeply. But the deeper their emotional attachment becomes, the more fragile their mental state becomes. And again, this brings us back to the central phrase. The tighter you grip the outcome, the more fragile your state becomes. Now here is where something important happens. At this point, many people hear this idea and misunderstand it. They assume the solution must be to stop caring entirely. But that is not the message. The goal is not indifference. The goal is freedom from emotional dependence. There is a powerful difference between those two states. Indifference means you stop trying. Emotional independence means you continue taking action, but your identity is no longer negotiating with the result. You care about the direction you are moving, but your sense of self remains stable whether the outcome arrives immediately or takes time to unfold. This is the state where performance becomes natural again. This is the state where creativity returns. This is the state where opportunities begin responding to you differently. Because people who operate from emotional independence project something subtle but powerful. They project certainty without pressure. And certainty without pressure is deeply attractive in human interactions. It signals confidence. It signals stability. It signals that you are not desperately trying to extract validation from the moment. Now pause for a moment and think about something. Consider the last time something mattered so much that you began overthinking every step. Maybe you replayed conversations in your mind. Maybe you rehearsed possibilities again and again. Maybe you tried to control every detail to avoid making a mistake. In those moments, your intention was probably good. You were trying to ensure success. But in reality, something else was happening. Your mind had quietly entered outcome dependency. And outcome dependency creates tension. Tension reduces clarity. Clarity disappears, and the opportunity becomes harder to navigate. But once you begin noticing this pattern, something powerful changes. Because awareness weakens unconscious behavior. The moment you notice the pressure forming, you gain the ability to loosen your grip on the outcome. And when that grip loosens, your mind begins returning to its natural state of calm attention. This is where confidence begins rebuilding itself, not through forcing belief, but through removing pressure. Now here is the interesting part. What we have explored so far explains why wanting something too much can destabilize your state. But wanting too much is only the surface of a deeper pattern inside the human mind. Because the real issue is not desire itself. The real issue is something far more subtle. Something connected to how the brain protects the identity it believes you are. And once you understand this deeper mechanism, many of the strange behaviors people exhibit around opportunity, success, and even happiness suddenly begin making sense. Because the mind does not simply chase what it wants. It also protects what feels familiar, even if that familiarity limits growth. Even if that familiarity repeats the same patterns year after year. And this is where our journey moves next. You've begun to see how emotional dependence on outcomes can weaken clarity and confidence. But there is an even deeper reason the mind resists certain opportunities. A reason connected not to comfort, but to familiarity. And once you see it clearly, you will begin noticing it everywhere. You've just discovered how gripping outcomes too tightly creates pressure that quietly sabotages performance. But the mind has another hidden mechanism, one that keeps people repeating the same patterns for years. Because the greatest barrier to change is rarely discomfort. It is familiarity. An understanding that single truth changes how you see the comfort zone forever. So now let's go deeper. Chapter 2. The comfort zone is not comfort. There is a phrase that has been repeated so many times in personal development that most people stop thinking about what it actually means. You've probably heard it before. Step outside your comfort zone. It sounds simple. It sounds logical. It even sounds motivating. But if we slow down for a moment and look at the way the human mind actually behaves, something unusual begins to appear. Because the so-called comfort zone is rarely comfortable at all. In fact, many people live inside patterns that create stress, frustration, and limitation every single day, and yet they remain inside those patterns for years, sometimes for decades. Think about that carefully. People stay in careers that drain their energy. They stay in habits that repeat the same problems. They remain in routines that quietly limit their growth. And yet when an opportunity appears that could change everything, the mind suddenly hesitates. Not because the current situation is comfortable, but because it is familiar. And familiarity has a powerful influence on the brain. This is the first important realization of this chapter. The comfort zone is not really about comfort. It is about predictability. The brain prefers a predictable struggle over an unpredictable possibility. That may sound strange at first, but if you observe human behavior closely, you begin to see it everywhere. Someone may complain about their job for years, yet feel strangely uneasy when presented with a new opportunity. Someone may dream about starting something new, yet hesitate the moment the chance becomes real. Someone may say they want change, but unconsciously return to the same patterns again and again. And the reason is not laziness. The reason is not a lack of intelligence. The reason is that the brain is constantly protecting something deeper than immediate comfort. It is protecting identity stability. Your brain does not only care about survival. It also cares about maintaining the story it believes about who you are. Because identity creates psychological stability. It tells the mind what to expect. It tells the mind what behaviors are normal. It tells the mind what future possibilities feel believable. And once the brain accepts a certain identity, it begins organizing your behavior around protecting that identity. This happens quietly, automatically, and almost entirely outside conscious awareness. Which means many of the decisions people make are not really about the situation in front of them. They are about whether that situation fits the identity the mind already believes. This is why two people can face the exact same opportunity and react completely differently. One person sees possibility. The other person feels hesitation. One person moves forward with curiosity. The other begins listing reasons why the timing isn't right. Externally, the opportunity is identical. But internally, the situation is being filtered through two different identities. One identity says, "This is something people like me do." The other identity says, "This feels unfamiliar for someone like me." And when something feels unfamiliar to identity, the brain quietly applies resistance. This resistance often disguises itself as logic. It appears as cautious thinking. It appears as careful planning. It appears as waiting for the perfect moment. But underneath all of those explanations, the real mechanism is simple. The mind is protecting the identity it believes you are. And this brings us to one of the most important phrases you will hear repeated throughout this audiobook. Because once you truly understand it, you begin to see human behavior in a completely new way. The mind protects the identity it believes you are. Let that settle for a moment. Because once the brain believes something about who you are, it begins defending that belief with surprising strength. If the identity says you are someone who plays it safe, the mind will quietly resist risks. If the identity says you are someone who struggles financially, opportunities for abundance may feel strangely uncomfortable. If the identity says you are someone who stays in the background, visibility may trigger hesitation. This is why people sometimes sabotage progress right before things begin improving. Not because they want failure, but because success would require becoming someone unfamiliar. An unfamiliar identity creates psychological instability. The brain prefers stability. Even if that stability comes with frustration. Even if that stability repeats the same problems. This is the hidden force behind many of life's repeating patterns. People believe they are chasing better outcomes, but the mind is simultaneously protecting a familiar identity. And when those two forces conflict, identity usually wins. Now pause for a moment and think about something in your own life. Have you ever noticed how certain changes feel strangely uncomfortable, even when they are positive? Perhaps you received recognition that felt difficult to accept. Perhaps someone believed in your potential more strongly than you believed in yourself. Perhaps an opportunity appeared that required you to step into a role you had never occupied before. And suddenly your mind began generating reasons to slow down, reasons to wait, reasons to stay where things felt more predictable. This is the identity protection mechanism at work. Again, not because the opportunity is wrong, but because the opportunity requires an identity the brain has not fully accepted yet. And this is where the idea of the comfort zone becomes clearer. The comfort zone is not defined by how pleasant something feels. It is defined by how familiar something feels. Familiar stress feels safer to the brain than unfamiliar growth. This is why people can remain in difficult situations for long periods of time, because at least those situations are predictable. They understand the rules. They understand the environment. They understand the version of themselves that exists inside that pattern. But when a new path appears, everything becomes uncertain. The rules change. The environment changes. And most importantly, the identity must change. An identity change is one of the most psychologically challenging transitions the brain can experience, because it requires letting go of the familiar version of yourself. It requires stepping into a space where the old patterns no longer define you, but the new patterns are not fully formed yet. This is the space where many people retreat back into familiarity. But here is where something powerful begins to emerge. Because once you understand that the mind protects identity, you begin realizing that many of the limits you once believed were external were actually identity boundaries, not permanent limits, just boundaries created by the mind's desire for familiarity. And when those boundaries are recognized, something interesting happens. They begin losing their power, because identity is not fixed. Identity is practiced. Identity is reinforced by repeated thoughts, behaviors, and expectations, which means identity can evolve. But there is a condition that must be present for that evolution to happen. And that condition connects directly to the central idea of this audiobook. The moment identity stops being tied to emotional dependence on outcomes, freedom appears. Because if your identity is not negotiating with results, then opportunities stop feeling like tests of self-worth. They simply become experiences, experiments, paths worth exploring. And suddenly the brain relaxes. The pressure disappears. The mind becomes curious again. This is where the frequency of not caring begins changing everything. Not caring does not mean apathy. It means your identity is no longer threatened by uncertainty. It means success does not inflate your sense of self, and failure does not diminish it. Your identity becomes stable regardless of temporary outcomes. And when that happens, the mind stops resisting unfamiliar opportunities, because the risk to identity disappears. You are no longer trying to prove something. You are simply expressing who you are becoming. And this shift changes the way the world responds to you. Because people who operate from identity stability carry a certain presence, a calm energy, a quiet certainty. They are not desperately trying to extract validation from every interaction. They are simply participating in life from a grounded sense of self. And that energy is powerful. It makes decisions clearer. It makes action easier. It makes growth feel natural instead of threatening. So if the comfort zone is really a familiarity zone, and if identity determines what feels familiar, then transformation begins with something surprisingly simple. Expanding the identity you allow yourself to inhabit, not through force, not through pressure, but through gradual shifts in how you see yourself and the possibilities around you. And this brings us back to the central theme of this entire journey. Because the moment you stop gripping outcomes as proof of your worth, the mind begins relaxing its grip on the old identity. And when that grip loosens, space opens for a new version of yourself to emerge. A version not defined by familiar limitations. A version not controlled by old expectations. A version that can explore opportunity without emotional pressure. And that is the moment when life begins feeling different. Not because circumstances magically change overnight, but because your relationship with possibility changes. Your energy becomes lighter. Your thinking becomes clearer. And the world begins meeting you differently. But there is still something deeper we need to explore. Because understanding the comfort zone reveals why the mind resists unfamiliar possibilities. Yet there is another layer beneath this. A layer that explains why emotional independence creates something almost magnetic in human interactions. A certain presence that makes opportunities, conversations, and connections unfold more naturally. And once you understand this next principle, the idea of manifesting through not caring will begin making much more sense. You've just discovered that the comfort zone isn't really about comfort at all. It's about familiarity. And the mind will protect that familiarity, even if it keeps you repeating the same patterns. But something extraordinary happens when identity becomes stable enough that unfamiliar opportunities no longer feel threatening. Because that is the moment a new internal frequency begins to appear. A frequency that removes desperation and replaces it with calm presence. And strangely, that calm presence is often what attracts the very outcomes people use to chase. So now we arrive at the core idea of this entire audiobook, the principle that quietly changes how people move through life. Chapter 3. The Secret Frequency, Emotional Independence. Up to this point, you have seen two important patterns. First, when people grip outcomes too tightly, pressure appears and performance becomes fragile. Second, the brain protects familiar identity, even when that familiarity keeps life smaller than it could be. Now we arrive at the principle that quietly resolves both of those problems. A principle that changes the way a person thinks, moves, speaks, and responds to opportunity. This principle is emotional independence, and it is the hidden frequency behind what many people describe as confidence, presence, or personal magnetism. But emotional independence is often misunderstood. Many people hear the phrase not caring and immediately imagine indifference. They imagine someone who lacks ambition, someone who avoids responsibility, someone who drifts through life without direction. But emotional independence is not about withdrawing from life. It is about removing the invisible pressure that turns every opportunity into a test of identity. In other words, you still care about what you are building. You still take action. You still pursue growth and improvement. But your sense of self is no longer tied to the immediate outcome. And when that shift happens, something remarkable occurs inside the mind. The nervous system relaxes. Attention becomes clearer. Decisions become simpler. And the energy you project into the world changes. Because the mind is no longer asking the question that creates tension. That question is simple but powerful. What does this outcome say about me? When that question disappears, a different psychological state takes its place. A state where action becomes exploration rather than evaluation. This state is where creativity lives. It is where confidence appears. It is where opportunities begin unfolding naturally rather than feeling forced. This is the state we are describing as the secret frequency. Now imagine two people walking into the exact same opportunity. Perhaps it is a conversation that could lead to a new relationship. Perhaps it is a presentation that could influence a career. Perhaps it is the first step toward building something meaningful. Externally, the situation looks identical for both individuals. But internally, the experiences are completely different. The first person enters the situation with a hidden expectation. They need the interaction to go well. They need approval. They need validation. They need confirmation that they are capable, respected, or worthy. Because of that need, their mind quietly begins scanning for signals. Do people seem impressed? Did that response sound intelligent enough? Am I saying the right thing? Should I adjust my behavior to be more accepted? All of this mental activity happens rapidly, often below conscious awareness. But it creates subtle tension. The person begins monitoring themselves instead of simply participating in the moment. Now imagine the second person entering the same situation. This person cares about the opportunity. They prepared. They value the experience. But they are not dependent on the outcome to define their identity. They do not require approval in order to feel stable. They do not interpret every reaction as a verdict about their worth. They are simply exploring the possibility in front of them. Because of that difference, their attention remains grounded in the present moment. Their thoughts move more slowly. Their responses feel natural. Their body language appears relaxed. And the interaction begins unfolding with surprising ease. From the outside, observers often interpret this difference as confidence. But the real mechanism is simpler than that. One person needs the outcome. The other person is free from needing the outcome. And that freedom changes everything. Because emotional independence removes the invisible pressure that disrupts natural behavior. This is why people often perform better in situations where the stakes feel lower. For example, someone may speak effortlessly in casual conversation, but when the same person stands in front of an audience, their voice tightens. Their mind races. Their thoughts become harder to organize. The ability did not disappear. The pressure increased. The mind began associating the moment with identity evaluation. But when emotional independence exists, the situation remains stable. Action continues without psychological strain. Now here is something worth noticing. People who operate from emotional independence often appear calm in situations where others become tense. They listen more carefully. They react more thoughtfully. They do not rush to fill silence. They are comfortable allowing moments to unfold naturally. This calmness creates an interesting effect. Other people begin feeling more relaxed in their presence. Conversations become smoother. Trust forms more easily. Ideas flow with greater clarity. And opportunities begin appearing in ways that seem almost coincidental. But the underlying cause is not coincidence. It is the energy created by emotional independence. This is where we return to a line that will echo throughout this entire journey, because it captures the essence of what happens when emotional dependence disappears. The moment you stop needing the outcome, your energy becomes calm, focused, and magnetic. Notice the words carefully. Calm, focused, magnetic. Calm, because the nervous system is no longer preparing for psychological threat. Focused, because attention is not divided between performance and self-evaluation. Magnetic, because people naturally gravitate toward individuals who project emotional stability. Think about the people you admire most in life. They may be leaders, creators, entrepreneurs, or thinkers. But if you observe them closely, one characteristic appears again and again. They pursue their goals with commitment. Yet they are not visibly desperate for validation. They move forward with a kind of quiet certainty. Not arrogance, not indifference. Simply a grounded sense that their identity does not rise or fall with every outcome. This state allows them to take risks that others hesitate to attempt, because failure is no longer interpreted as a threat to identity. It becomes information, experience, feedback that guides the next decision. And this mindset creates momentum. When someone no longer fears identity loss, they are willing to experiment more freely. More experiments lead to more learning. More learning leads to better decisions. Better decisions eventually produce stronger outcomes. From the outside, it may appear that these individuals simply possess unusual confidence. But the deeper truth is that they are operating from emotional independence. Now pause for a moment and reflect on something in your own life. Think about the decisions you have made over the years. Think about the opportunities you pursued and the opportunities you avoided. Ask yourself a simple question. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, how many decisions in your life were shaped by needing validation? How many choices were influenced by the hope of approval? How many moments of hesitation appeared because failure might have affected how you saw yourself? How many conversations were shaped by trying to appear impressive rather than simply being present? This reflection is not meant to create judgment. It is meant to create awareness. Because once you begin recognizing the role emotional dependence has played in your decisions, you gain the ability to shift your relationship with outcomes. And that shift changes how you experience life itself. When emotional independence grows stronger, opportunities stop feeling like tests. They become paths to explore. People stop feeling like judges. They become collaborators in shared experiences. And the future stops feeling like something fragile that must be perfectly controlled. It becomes something dynamic that can unfold in many directions. This change in perspective creates one of the most powerful internal states a human being can experience. a state where effort exists without desperation, where ambition exists without pressure, where action flows from identity rather than insecurity. And this is why emotional independence can feel almost magnetic to others, because it communicates something subtle but powerful. It communicates that your presence is stable, that your identity is grounded, that you are not extracting validation from the moment. You are simply participating in it. People trust that energy. They respect it. They are drawn toward it. And opportunities often respond to it. Not because the universe is granting favors, but because calm clarity allows you to recognize possibilities that pressure once obscured. Now remember the central theme we introduced earlier. Life tends to respond not only to what you want, but to the identity you embody while pursuing it. When identity is dependent on outcomes, pressure appears. When identity is independent of outcomes, presence appears. And presence changes everything. It changes how you communicate. It changes how you decide. It changes how you respond to uncertainty. But emotional independence also creates another important transformation. Because once you stop needing the outcome, you begin discovering a new kind of confidence. Not the fragile confidence that depends on winning, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your identity remains intact no matter what happens next. And that type of confidence allows you to move through life differently. You become more curious, more creative, more willing to explore unfamiliar paths. And that exploration naturally expands the possibilities available to you. But there is another fascinating effect that begins appearing when emotional independence becomes part of your identity. An effect that explains why calm individuals often seem to influence situations more effectively than those who try too hard. Because the energy people carry into interactions affects everyone involved. Calm energy stabilizes environments. It slows the pace of tension. It creates space for thoughtful responses rather than reactive ones. And this ability to stabilize situations is one of the most powerful forms of influence a person can develop. So emotional independence is not simply about reducing pressure. It is about cultivating the internal stability that allows your natural abilities to emerge without interference. And when that stability becomes consistent, life begins feeling less like a struggle to prove yourself, and more like a process of expressing who you are becoming. That is the essence of the secret frequency. A frequency where identity remains steady while actions continue evolving. A frequency where effort exists without emotional attachment to specific results. A frequency where opportunities can be pursued without fear of identity loss. And when this frequency becomes part of your everyday life, a surprising shift occurs. You stop chasing validation. You start creating experiences. You stop gripping outcomes. You start engaging with possibilities. And as this transformation unfolds, something remarkable becomes clear. Calm energy is not passive. It is powerful. In fact, calm energy is often the foundation of the most confident individuals you will ever meet. Which brings us to the next discovery in this journey. Because if emotional independence creates calm presence, then we must ask an important question. Why does calmness itself seem to amplify confidence? Why do people who remain composed under pressure often appear more capable than those who try harder? The answer lies in understanding how calm energy affects the mind, the body, and the people around you. And once you see it clearly, you will begin noticing it in every area of life. You have just discovered the secret frequency behind emotional independence. A state where your identity is no longer negotiating with every outcome, allowing your energy to become calm, focused, and magnetic. But emotional independence reveals another surprising truth. Confidence is not created by success. Confidence is created by the calm state that allows success to unfold. So now we explore the next layer of this transformation. Chapter 4. The magnetic effect of calm energy. There is a belief that many people carry quietly throughout their lives. It is rarely stated directly, but it influences behavior in subtle ways. The belief sounds something like this. Once I succeed, then I will feel confident. Once the business works, confidence will appear. Once people respect me, confidence will grow. Once I achieve the goal, then I will finally feel secure in myself. This belief feels logical at first. After all, success should create confidence, right? But if you observe the patterns of human behavior carefully, something surprising begins to emerge. Confidence does not usually appear after success. Instead, confidence often appears before success. Not because someone knows the future will work out perfectly, but because they have learned how to maintain emotional stability even when the outcome remains uncertain. This is a powerful distinction. Many people think confidence is the reward for winning. But in reality, confidence is often the emotional environment that allows winning to happen. When the mind remains stable, the body remains relaxed. When the body remains relaxed, thinking becomes clearer. When thinking becomes clearer, decisions improve. And improved decisions naturally increase the probability of success. In other words, emotional stability creates the conditions where ability can operate freely. Without that stability, ability becomes tangled in pressure. And this is where calm energy begins revealing its quiet power. Calm energy is not dramatic. It does not shout for attention. It does not demand validation. Instead, calm energy operates like a stabilizing force inside chaotic environments. When someone carries calm energy into a room, conversations slow down. People feel less defensive. Ideas are expressed more clearly. The atmosphere becomes easier to navigate. This is why certain individuals seem to influence situations without raising their voice or forcing control. Their calm presence changes the rhythm of the environment itself. Now consider the people who often appear confident in moments of pressure. Entrepreneurs presenting new ideas, leaders making difficult decisions, creators sharing work that has never existed before. From the outside, they may appear fearless. But if you speak to enough of them, you will discover something interesting. They do feel uncertainty. They do experience doubt. They do recognize the possibility of failure. But they are not emotionally dependent on immediate validation. They have learned how to move forward without requiring constant confirmation that everything will work out perfectly. That emotional independence allows them to stay calm while others become tense. And because they remain calm, their thinking stays organized. Their speech stays natural. Their behavior stays authentic. This creates an effect that many people interpret as confidence. But the real foundation is emotional stability. Imagine two entrepreneurs presenting the same idea to potential investors. Both have prepared. Both believe in their concept. But internally, their emotional states are very different. The first entrepreneur needs approval from the room. Their mind quietly whispers, "This presentation has to work. If they reject this idea, it means something about me." Because of that internal pressure, every reaction in the room feels significant. A neutral facial expression may be interpreted as doubt. A moment of silence may feel uncomfortable. The presenter begins adjusting their behavior constantly in response to perceived judgment. This creates subtle tension. Now imagine the second entrepreneur presenting the same idea. They care about the opportunity. They believe in what they have built. But their identity does not depend on the outcome of this meeting. If the investors are interested, excellent. If the investors decline, that information simply guides the next step. Because of that mindset, their energy remains calm. Their speech flows naturally. They are fully present in the conversation instead of monitoring themselves. From the outside, the difference between these two individuals becomes very noticeable. One appears tense. The other appears confident. But the underlying difference is not intelligence, talent, or preparation. It is emotional dependence versus emotional independence. The person who remains calm is not demanding immediate validation from the moment. And that calmness changes how the room responds. People tend to trust calm individuals more easily. They feel safer expressing honest thoughts. They feel less pressured to react defensively. And the entire interaction becomes more collaborative rather than adversarial. This is the magnetic quality of calm energy. It quietly shapes the emotional environment around you. But calm energy also influences your own internal experience in profound ways. When the nervous system remains stable, your mind has more cognitive space available. You notice details you might have missed. You hear subtle signals in conversation. You respond thoughtfully instead of reacting impulsively. This clarity allows you to navigate complex situations with greater intelligence. It also reduces the mental fatigue created by constant self-monitoring. Think about how exhausting it feels when you are trying too hard to impress someone. Every word feels important. Every pause feels uncomfortable. Your attention constantly jumps between the conversation and your own performance. This state consumes enormous mental energy. But when emotional independence is present, something shifts. You are no longer performing. You are participating. You listen more deeply. You respond more honestly. You allow conversations to unfold naturally. And this relaxed authenticity often creates stronger connections than carefully constructed performance. Now, there is an important realization hidden inside this idea. Calm energy is not something that appears randomly. It is the result of a specific internal practice. The practice of releasing emotional urgency. Urgency creates pressure. Pressure creates tension. Tension disrupts clarity. Many people approach their goals with an intense sense of urgency. They believe speed proves dedication. They believe constant pressure produces results. But urgency often creates the very instability that makes progress harder. The mind becomes so focused on immediate results that it loses the ability to think strategically. It reacts rather than reflects. It pushes rather than observes. And when actions are driven primarily by urgency, mistakes increase. But when urgency is replaced by curiosity, the entire experience changes. Curiosity slows the mind down. It opens attention rather than narrowing it. It transforms challenges into learning opportunities rather than threats. This brings us to a simple but powerful coaching practice. Whenever you notice urgency rising inside your mind, pause for a moment and replace it with curiosity. Instead of asking, "How do I make this work immediately?" ask, "What can I learn from this situation?" Instead of thinking, "This has to succeed," try asking, "What possibilities might emerge if I explore this calmly?" Curiosity creates mental flexibility. It allows the mind to consider options that urgency might overlook. It also reinforces emotional independence because curiosity focuses on discovery rather than validation. This shift may seem subtle at first, but its effects accumulate over time. Each moment you replace urgency with curiosity, you weaken the habit of emotional dependence. You strengthen the habit of calm presence. And slowly, that presence becomes part of your identity. People begin experiencing you differently. You appear grounded in conversations that once felt stressful. You respond thoughtfully in situations that once triggered anxiety. You move through uncertainty with composure. And because of that composure, opportunities often open in unexpected ways. But something even deeper begins to happen when calm energy becomes consistent. Because eventually, emotional independence stops being something you practice occasionally. It becomes something you are. Your identity shifts from someone who reacts to outcomes to someone who remains stable regardless of them. And when that transformation occurs, the way you approach life begins changing dramatically. You stop measuring your worth through temporary results. You stop interpreting every challenge as a personal verdict. You stop chasing validation from every interaction. Instead, you begin expressing your ideas, talents, and actions from a place of internal certainty. Not certainty about outcomes, but certainty about who you are becoming. This identity shift is where the real power of emotional independence begins revealing itself. Because once emotional independence becomes part of your identity, the pressure that once controlled your behavior disappears. You no longer need the environment to confirm your value. You no longer need immediate success to justify your efforts. You simply move forward because growth itself has become part of who you are. And this mindset changes everything. It changes how you respond to uncertainty. It changes how long you remain committed to meaningful goals. It changes the risks you are willing to explore. And perhaps most importantly, it changes the way people perceive your presence. Calm energy combined with identity stability creates a powerful signal. It communicates that you are not easily shaken, that your direction is internally guided, that your confidence does not depend on constant external approval. People notice that. They respect it. They often trust it. And this trust creates new pathways for collaboration, influence, and opportunity. But the transformation does not end here. Because emotional independence and calm energy eventually lead to another powerful realization. A realization about the difference between performing confidence and embodying identity. Many people spend years trying to appear confident. They study body language. They practice persuasive communication. They attempt to display certainty even when they feel unsure. But there is a profound difference between performing confidence and becoming the person who naturally expresses it. And once you understand that difference, a deeper identity shift begins. You've just seen how calm energy transforms the way people think, act, and influence the environments around them. Confidence, it turns out, is not something that suddenly appears after success. It is something that grows from emotional stability before success arrives. But calm presence leads to an even deeper discovery. Because many people spend years trying to perform confidence, when the real transformation happens when confidence becomes part of identity itself. So now we move to the next step in this journey. A step that reveals the difference between acting confident and truly becoming someone new. Chapter 5. Stop performing, start embodying. There is a quiet struggle that many people experience when they begin trying to improve their lives. They read books. They listen to ideas that promise growth. They learn techniques that claim to build confidence, influence, and success. And for a while, they try to apply what they've learned. They adjust their posture. They practice speaking more assertively. They attempt to appear more certain in conversations. Sometimes these efforts produce short bursts of improvement, but often something strange happens. After a few days or weeks, the new behavior fades. Old habits return. The person begins wondering why the transformation didn't last. The answer usually has very little to do with discipline. The real issue lies in a subtle misunderstanding. Most people try to perform confidence. Very few people focus on embodying identity. At first glance, those two approaches may look similar. Both involve changing behavior. Both involve stepping into unfamiliar patterns. But internally, they operate in completely different ways. When someone performs confidence, they are essentially acting. They are displaying behaviors they believe confident people exhibit. They are trying to imitate a version of themselves they have not yet fully accepted internally. And because the behavior feels slightly artificial, the brain remains aware of the gap between the performance and the identity. That awareness creates tension. It creates self-monitoring. The mind constantly checks whether the performance is convincing. This is why performing confidence often feels exhausting. The person must maintain the act. They must manage impressions. They must remember the script they are trying to follow. Eventually, mental fatigue appears. the performance weakens, and the individual slips back into familiar behavior. But when someone embodies identity, something completely different occurs. Instead of asking, "How should I behave right now?" they ask, "Who am I becoming?" The focus shifts from external performance to internal alignment. Identity becomes the foundation. Behavior becomes the natural expression of that identity. When identity changes, behavior does not require constant effort. It flows automatically. Think about the difference between someone pretending to be calm and someone who genuinely feels calm. The first person must monitor their voice, their posture, their expressions. The second person simply exists in that state. There is no performance involved. Their calmness is authentic. And authenticity carries a very distinct signal that people instinctively recognize. The human brain is remarkably sensitive to authenticity. Long before we consciously analyze someone's behavior, our nervous system detects subtle cues: tone of voice, facial microexpressions, body tension, energy patterns in movement and speech. All of these signals reveal whether a person is acting or simply being themselves. When someone performs confidence without embodying it internally, small inconsistencies appear. The words may sound strong, but the energy underneath them feels uncertain. The posture may look deliberate, but the movements feel slightly rigid. The message may sound convincing, but the presence behind it lacks ease. People may not consciously identify these signals, but they feel them. This is why authentic confidence often feels so powerful. When identity and behavior align, the brain relaxes. There is no internal conflict. No need to manage impressions. The person simply expresses themselves naturally. And that natural expression creates trust. It creates clarity. It creates a kind of quiet authority that performance cannot replicate. Now here is the important realization. Identity is not created by declaring who you want to be. Identity is created by the patterns you repeatedly protect. Every thought you reinforce. Every action you repeat. Every behavior you justify. All of these signals tell the brain what identity it should maintain. This is why we return again and again to one central phrase, because it captures the mechanism behind almost every personal pattern. Your life follows the identity you protect. If you protect the identity of someone who hesitates, hesitation becomes normal. If you protect the identity of someone who avoids risk, caution becomes habitual. If you protect the identity of someone who doubts their ability, opportunities begin feeling threatening. But the moment you begin protecting a different identity, new patterns begin forming. Not instantly, but gradually, through consistent reinforcement. And once the brain accepts that new identity is familiar, behavior begins aligning with it naturally. This is why the shift from performing to embodying is so important. Performance tries to force behavior before identity has changed. Embodiment focuses on reshaping identity so behavior emerges organically. Now pause for a moment and consider something honestly. Imagine that someone observed your daily behavior without hearing your internal thoughts. They watched how you respond to opportunities. They noticed how you react when something goes wrong. They observed the types of risks you take and the moments when you hold back. Based only on your actions, what identity would they assume you believe you are? This question reveals something powerful, because identity is not defined by what we say about ourselves. It is revealed through the patterns we consistently protect. Your habits tell the story. Your reactions tell the story. Your willingness to explore unfamiliar possibilities tells the story. And that story shapes the trajectory of your life. Now here is where emotional independence becomes essential. When someone is emotionally dependent on outcomes, they tend to protect fragile identities. Identities that require validation. Identities that fear mistakes. Identities that avoid situations where uncertainty might expose insecurity. But when emotional independence grows stronger, identity becomes more flexible. It becomes less defensive, less fragile, less tied to temporary results. And that flexibility allows new versions of the self to emerge. Instead of protecting old patterns, the mind begins protecting growth. Instead of defending limitations, the brain begins reinforcing possibility. This shift may feel subtle in the beginning, but over time, it changes how you approach almost everything. You start entering conversations as someone who belongs there. You approach opportunities as someone capable of learning. You face challenges as someone who evolves through experience. And because those identities become familiar, behavior begins reflecting them naturally. This is embodiment. You are no longer acting confident. You are living from an identity that no longer questions your right to participate in meaningful experiences. That identity produces calm energy. It produces clarity. It produces resilience when things do not go perfectly. And that resilience allows you to remain engaged long enough for real progress to happen. People who succeed consistently rarely perform their way to success. They embody identities that make success a natural extension of their behavior. An athlete embodies discipline. An entrepreneur embodies experimentation. A creator embodies expression. These identities guide behavior automatically. There is no constant debate about what to do next. The identity itself answers that question. Now here is something fascinating. When you embody an identity that is not emotionally dependent on outcomes, pressure begins disappearing. Because the goal is no longer to prove something. The goal becomes expressing who you are becoming. This removes the tension that once accompanied every challenge. You stop asking, "What if this fails?" You start asking, "What will I learn if I explore this?" That shift transforms fear into curiosity. It transforms hesitation into experimentation. And over time, experimentation leads to experience. Experience leads to mastery. Mastery leads to outcomes that once seemed distant. But those outcomes arrive as side effects of identity, not as the source of identity. And that distinction changes everything. Because when identity leads behavior, progress becomes sustainable. You are no longer forcing yourself to act differently. You are simply living in alignment with the person you have decided to become. And this alignment creates something powerful. Consistency. Not rigid discipline. Not exhausting motivation. But natural consistency that emerges from identity itself. Now here is where the journey deepens even further. Because once someone begins embodying a new identity, an interesting psychological phenomenon appears. Sometimes, right before a breakthrough occurs, the mind tries to pull the person back into familiar patterns. Old doubts resurface. Old habits try to reassert themselves. Suddenly, the new identity feels slightly unstable again. Many people interpret this moment as failure, but it is actually a sign of transition. The brain is adjusting. It is reorganizing the patterns that define familiarity. And understanding this process becomes incredibly important, because recognizing these moments allows you to continue moving forward instead of retreating into old behavior. The transformation of identity is not a straight line. It is a process of gradual reinforcement, and the brain will occasionally test whether the new identity is truly stable. That is why the next discovery in this journey matters so much. Because once you begin embodying new identities, you must also understand why the brain sometimes resists unfamiliar success. Not because success is undesirable, but because success can disrupt the identity the mind has spent years protecting. And learning how to navigate that resistance is the next step toward lasting transformation. You've just seen the difference between performing confidence and embodying identity. Performance requires constant effort. Embodiment creates natural behavior that flows from who you believe you are. Because in the end, your habits, decisions, and opportunities always align with the identity you protect. But something fascinating happens the moment a new identity begins forming. Sometimes the mind resists the very success it claims to want, not because growth is wrong, but because growth challenges the familiarity the brain has learned to defend. So now we explore the hidden reason the mind sometimes pushes back just before life begins to expand. Chapter 6. Why the Brain Resists New Success. There is a moment that appears again and again in the stories of people who eventually transform their lives. It is a moment that can feel confusing, frustrating, and sometimes even discouraging. Because just when progress seems closest, something unexpected happens. Momentum slows down. Doubt reappears. Old habits quietly begin knocking on the door again. And the person who seemed ready for a breakthrough suddenly hesitates. From the outside, this moment can look like failure. But in reality, something deeper is happening inside the mind. The brain is adjusting to the possibility of a new identity. And that adjustment can create temporary resistance. This may seem strange at first. After all, if someone truly wants success, why would the mind resist it? The answer lies in understanding how the brain organizes stability. The human mind does not only pursue improvement, it also prioritizes predictability. Predictability allows the brain to conserve energy. It creates familiar patterns that require less constant evaluation. Once those patterns are established, the brain begins protecting them, even if the patterns include limitation, even if the patterns include frustration. Because from the brain's perspective, predictability feels safer than uncertainty. This is why people often remain inside routines that no longer serve them. Those routines may not create happiness, but they create familiarity. And familiarity reduces the mental work required to navigate daily life. But the moment success begins expanding someone's reality, that familiarity changes. New expectations appear. New responsibilities emerge. New behaviors must be maintained. In other words, success requires identity expansion. And identity expansion introduces uncertainty. This is where the brain begins asking an unconscious question. Is this new version of life stable enough to trust? If the identity supporting that success is not fully formed yet, the brain may attempt to return to familiar patterns. Not because it wants failure, but because it wants stability. This dynamic explains something many people experience right before major breakthroughs. They begin making progress. Opportunities start appearing. Confidence begins growing. And then suddenly, hesitation shows up again. A person may delay an important decision. They may avoid following up on an opportunity. They may return to habits they had already begun leaving behind. This behavior often confuses them. They wonder why they would sabotage something they worked so hard to build. But sabotage is rarely the true intention. The deeper issue is that the internal identity has not fully aligned with the external opportunity. The mind still recognizes the old identity as familiar. And until the new identity becomes stable, the brain may pull the person back toward what feels predictable. This is why personal transformation often includes moments of temporary regression. The brain is testing whether the new identity can truly sustain the change. Once that identity becomes stronger, the resistance fades. But before that happens, awareness becomes extremely important, because recognizing this pattern allows you to navigate it without losing momentum. Imagine someone who has spent years believing they are not particularly skilled in leadership. They begin working on themselves. They develop new communication abilities. They start thinking more strategically. Eventually, an opportunity appears that requires them to step into a leadership role. Externally, they now possess the skills. But internally, the identity may still carry traces of the old belief. I'm not the type of person who leads. This creates a quiet internal conflict. The opportunity says one thing. The identity says another. The brain senses this mismatch. And because identity stability is important for psychological comfort, the mind may generate hesitation. Suddenly the opportunity feels overwhelming. Questions appear. Am I really ready for this? What if I fail? What if people expect more than I can deliver? These thoughts are not evidence that the opportunity is wrong. They are signals that the identity is still updating. And this realization changes how you respond to these moments. Instead of interpreting doubt as a warning sign, you begin seeing it as part of the transition process. You recognize that the brain is simply adjusting to a new level of possibility. This awareness prevents unnecessary retreat, because when people misunderstand this phase, they often step backward. They return to familiar environments. They reduce their ambitions. They convince themselves that the opportunity was unrealistic. But in truth, they were standing at the edge of identity expansion. Now here is the key insight that allows progress to continue during these moments. Stop identifying primarily with the outcome. Start identifying with the process. When identity is attached to outcomes, every result becomes emotionally charged. Success feels like validation. Failure feels like a threat. This emotional intensity makes the brain cautious. But when identity attaches to the process instead, something changes. The goal becomes participation rather than validation. The focus shifts from proving something to learning something. A creator who identifies with the process of creating will continue producing work regardless of immediate recognition. An entrepreneur who identifies with experimentation will continue testing ideas, even when some fail. An athlete who identifies with training will continue improving whether or not every competition ends in victory. In each of these examples, identity stabilizes around consistent action. Outcomes still matter, but they are no longer the foundation of identity. They become feedback instead, and feedback allows growth. This process-based identity creates resilience. When something doesn't work, the person adjusts. They learn. They continue moving forward. Because their identity remains intact. They are still someone who practices, explores, and evolves. Now imagine the opposite scenario. Someone identifies exclusively with outcomes. Their identity depends on winning. Their sense of worth depends on approval. Their motivation depends on immediate results. In this situation, every setback feels like a threat to identity. This creates emotional instability. The person may begin avoiding situations where failure is possible, or they may abandon projects too quickly when progress slows, because protecting identity becomes more important than continuing the process. This is why many people remain stuck at the threshold of potential breakthroughs. They are willing to pursue outcomes, but they have not yet anchored their identity in the process required to reach them. Once identity shifts toward the process, progress becomes sustainable. You show up consistently. You refine your abilities. You allow time for improvement. And over time, outcomes begin aligning with that steady effort. Now return for a moment to the idea we explored earlier. The brain prefers predictable identity over unpredictable growth. But if your identity becomes someone who values the process of growth itself, then growth becomes predictable. It becomes familiar. It becomes the new stability the brain begins protecting. This is where transformation accelerates. Because the brain no longer resists progress. It begins supporting it. Your habits reinforce learning. Your attention seeks improvement. Your behavior aligns with long-term development rather than short-term validation. And the resistance that once slowed you down gradually disappears. But there is another important realization waiting beneath this idea, something that many people overlook. Identity is not permanent. It is not something you are born with. It is something the brain constructs through repetition and belief, which means identity can change. Not instantly, not through wishful thinking, but through deliberate reinforcement of new patterns over time. Once the brain experiences a new identity consistently enough, It begins recognizing that identity as familiar. And once it becomes familiar, the mind starts protecting it just as strongly as it once protected the old version of you. This realization unlocks tremendous potential, because it means the patterns shaping your life are not fixed boundaries. They are adjustable structures. They can evolve. They can expand. They can adapt to the direction you choose. But understanding how to guide that evolution requires a deeper look at identity itself, how it forms, how it stabilizes, and how it can be intentionally upgraded. Because the next step in this journey involves recognizing that identity is far more flexible than most people ever imagine. And once you begin working with that flexibility consciously, the process of transformation becomes far less mysterious. It becomes something you can shape deliberately. You've just discovered why the brain sometimes resists new levels of success. Not because progress is undesirable, but because the mind prefers familiar identity over uncertain growth. And when identity attaches to outcomes, every challenge begins feeling like a threat. But the moment identity shifts toward the process of growth itself, stability returns. Learning becomes natural. Progress becomes sustainable. Yet this realization leads to an even more powerful discovery. Because identity itself is not fixed. It is not permanent. It is something the mind continually updates based on the patterns you reinforce. And understanding that flexibility changes how transformation unfolds. So now we explore how identity can evolve intentionally, and how that evolution creates a powerful momentum for growth. Chapter 7. The Identity Upgrade Loop. At this point in the journey, a powerful idea has begun revealing itself. Many people spend years trying to change their lives by chasing better results. They set goals. They create plans. They try to force themselves into new habits. Sometimes those efforts create temporary improvement, but very often the results fade. The person slowly returns to the same patterns they once tried to escape. This cycle repeats so often that many people eventually assume something is wrong with their discipline. They believe they simply lack the willpower required for long-term change. But the truth is much simpler. The problem is not usually effort. The problem is direction. Most people try to change outcomes before they change identity. And when identity stays the same, behavior eventually follows the familiar path again. This is why real transformation almost always begins with identity first. Results are the visible surface of life. Identity is the invisible structure underneath it. When that structure changes, the surface begins shifting naturally. But when the structure stays the same, even the strongest bursts of motivation eventually fade. Imagine someone who decides they want to become physically stronger. They begin going to the gym. They follow a strict routine for a few weeks. But internally, they still see themselves as someone who struggles with discipline. Every missed workout feels like proof that this identity is true. Eventually, the person stops training, not because exercise was impossible, but because their identity never fully accepted the change. Now imagine a different scenario. Instead of focusing primarily on the result, the person begins thinking differently about who they are becoming. They begin identifying as someone who trains consistently, not someone who hopes to be disciplined, someone who is disciplined. The difference may seem subtle, but the psychological effect is powerful. When identity changes, behavior becomes the natural extension of that identity. The person no longer asks themselves whether they should go to the gym. They simply follow the pattern that matches who they believe they are. This is the beginning of what we can call the identity upgrade loop. A cycle where identity shapes behavior, behavior reinforces identity, and the two begin strengthening each other over time. At first, the change may feel small, but as the loop continues, the momentum becomes stronger. New habits appear. Decisions become clearer. Progress accelerates. And eventually the external results begin reflecting the internal shift. To understand how powerful this loop can become, it helps to observe real-world examples. Look at athletes who perform at the highest levels of competition. Their training routines are intense. Their schedules are demanding. But for them, these behaviors do not feel like constant battles of discipline. They feel normal, because the athlete's identity already includes the belief, "I am someone who trains." That identity directs daily choices automatically. Skipping practice would feel inconsistent with who they believe they are. The same pattern appears in entrepreneurship. Successful entrepreneurs rarely describe themselves as people who occasionally experiment with ideas. They see themselves as builders, as problem solvers, as individuals who create value through innovation. Because that identity exists, they continue testing ideas even after failures. They continue learning when projects collapse. They continue refining strategies until something finally works. From the outside, it may appear that they possess extraordinary persistence. But internally, they are simply expressing the identity they have accepted. The same is true for creators. Writers who produce books, artists who develop new styles, musicians who compose original work. Their identities include the belief that they are creators, which means creating is not something they occasionally attempt. It is something they naturally do. And this is why identity is so powerful. Because once the brain accepts an identity as familiar, it begins organizing behavior around maintaining it. This brings us back to a phrase that captures the essence of the identity upgrade loop. A phrase that quietly explains why life patterns repeat until identity evolves. Your identity quietly directs your choices. It influences what opportunities feel possible. It shapes the risks you are willing to take. It affects how you interpret challenges. It determines whether a setback feels like failure or simply part of the process. And because identity operates beneath conscious awareness, many people never realize how strongly it shapes their lives. They believe they are making purely rational decisions. But those decisions are often guided by the identity the brain is protecting. This is why two individuals can face the same situation and respond in completely different ways. One person sees possibility. Another person sees risk. One person takes action. Another hesitates. Externally, the environment is identical. Internally, the identities interpreting that environment are different. Now here is the important realization. Identity can change, but it does not change through declarations alone. It changes through consistent reinforcement. Each time you act in alignment with a new identity, you strengthen the neural patterns supporting it. Each time you repeat that behavior, the brain becomes more comfortable with the idea that this is who you are. Eventually, the identity begins stabilizing. Once it stabilizes, behavior flows more naturally. This process takes patience, but it also creates incredible momentum once the loop begins turning. Because behavior strengthens identity. Identity strengthens behavior. And the cycle continues building itself. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself a question. Not casually, but honestly. Ask yourself, are your habits reinforcing the person you want to become or the person you used to be? Think about your daily routines, the way you respond to challenges, the choices you make when opportunities appear. Each of these behaviors sends signals to your brain about which identity you are reinforcing. If your habits reflect hesitation, the brain strengthens the identity of someone who hesitates. If your habits reflect exploration, the brain strengthens the identity of someone who grows. The identity upgrade loop operates constantly, whether you notice it or not, which means every day provides an opportunity to reinforce a different direction. But there is an important connection between this loop and the core theme of our journey. Because emotional independence makes identity upgrades possible. When people are emotionally dependent on outcomes, they become cautious about experimenting with new identities. They fear making mistakes. They fear appearing inexperienced. They fear temporary failures that might challenge how others perceive them. But when emotional independence grows stronger, these fears lose their power. Because identity is no longer tied to immediate validation, you become willing to explore new patterns. You allow yourself to grow into unfamiliar roles. You reinforce behaviors that align with the person you are becoming rather than the person you once believed you had to remain. This freedom allows the identity upgrade loop to accelerate. The brain begins adapting to new behaviors more quickly. Confidence grows naturally, and external results begin reflecting the internal transformation. But there is another important shift that happens during this process. Something subtle, yet incredibly powerful. You stop chasing outcomes as the primary source of motivation. Instead, you begin expressing identity through action. You move forward not because you must prove something, but because the behavior itself reflects who you are becoming. This shift removes enormous pressure. It replaces urgency with clarity. It replaces desperation with calm focus. And once that calm focus becomes consistent, the actions you take begin producing better results anyway. But those results are no longer the reason you act. They become the natural byproduct of the identity you are living. This is why the identity upgrade loop is so powerful. It removes the exhausting cycle of chasing motivation. Instead, it builds a structure where identity drives behavior automatically. And once that structure is strong enough, progress becomes sustainable. But there is another important element that strengthens this process even further. Because identity alone is not enough. Action must follow. Consistent action. Action taken without emotional dependence on immediate outcomes. Action that reflects the identity you are reinforcing. When identity and action align, momentum begins building. And that momentum eventually produces results that once seemed distant. Which brings us to the next discovery in this journey. Because once identity begins guiding your choices, the way you approach action itself must evolve. Many people act with pressure. They act with urgency. They act as though every step must immediately produce a result. But there is another way to move through life. A way that aligns perfectly with emotional independence and identity growth. A way that transforms action into something far more powerful. You've just seen how identity quietly directs your choices and shapes the direction of your life. When identity upgrades, behavior follows. And when behavior reinforces that identity, transformation begins gaining momentum. But there is one more piece required to unlock the full power of this process. Because action itself must change. Instead of acting with pressure, you must learn to act with freedom. Instead of forcing outcomes, you must move with calm intention. Because the most powerful actions are often the ones taken without emotional attachment to the result. So now we explore the next step in this evolution. Chapter 8. The Power of Detached Action. There is a belief deeply embedded in the way many people approach their goals. The belief is simple. If something matters, I should push harder. Push harder to make it work. Push harder to control the outcome. Push harder to prove that the effort will eventually pay off. At first glance, this belief appears logical. Effort leads to results. Persistence leads to progress. And in many situations, determination absolutely plays an important role. But there is a subtle distinction that most people never fully recognize. Effort is powerful. Pressure is not. And when effort becomes mixed with emotional pressure, something important begins to change inside the mind. Clarity fades. Creativity narrows. Decision-making becomes reactive rather than thoughtful. Instead of exploring possibilities, the mind begins forcing outcomes. And this is where a counterintuitive principle appears. Action works best when it is not emotionally pressured. In other words, the most powerful actions are often the ones taken from a calm internal state rather than a desperate one. Detached action does not mean passive behavior. It does not mean lack of commitment. It means the energy behind the action remains steady regardless of what happens next. The action is taken fully, but the identity of the person taking the action does not depend on the result. This distinction may seem small, but it creates a dramatic shift in how life unfolds. Because when action is driven by emotional pressure, every step becomes a test. The mind constantly asks questions such as, what if this doesn't work? What if I waste time? What if people see me fail? These questions create hesitation. They create overthinking. They create the internal noise that interrupts natural momentum. But when action becomes detached from emotional dependence, the experience changes. The focus shifts away from proving something and toward discovering something. Every step becomes an experiment. Every result becomes information. Every outcome becomes feedback. And feedback creates growth. Think about how scientists approach discovery. They do not treat each experiment as a judgment of their worth. They treat it as an exploration of reality. If the experiment works, they learn something valuable. If it fails, they also learn something valuable. The process continues either way. Now imagine applying that same mindset to your goals. Instead of seeing every action as a test of success or failure, you begin seeing it as a way of gathering information. You launch the idea to see what happens. You start the conversation to explore the possibility. You try the strategy to observe the results. The emotional pressure disappears because the action is no longer responsible for validating your identity. Your identity remains stable regardless of the outcome. This creates freedom. Freedom to experiment. Freedom to adjust. Freedom to continue moving forward without the fear of immediate judgment. Now let's consider a simple example. Imagine someone who wants to start a business. If their identity depends on immediate success, every decision becomes emotionally loaded. Choosing the wrong strategy feels dangerous. Making a mistake feels threatening. Because the outcome is tied to identity, the person becomes cautious. They analyze endlessly. They delay action while searching for certainty. But if the same individual approaches the goal with detached action, the process looks very different. They still care deeply about the idea. They still commit effort and attention. But they see each step as part of a larger exploration. One product launch is not the final verdict. One marketing attempt is not the ultimate judgment. Each action simply reveals new information. And that information improves the next decision. This mindset encourages movement rather than hesitation. It allows progress to continue even when uncertainty exists. Over time, the accumulation of experience leads to better strategies and stronger results. From the outside, it may appear that the person possesses unusual confidence. But the real source of that confidence is emotional independence. They are free to act without needing every step to succeed immediately. Now let's look at another example. Consider someone building relationships in their personal life. If they approach every interaction with the need for approval, conversations become tense. They analyze every word they say. They worry about how they are perceived. They attempt to control impressions. This emotional pressure makes the interaction feel unnatural. But when the same person approaches conversations with curiosity instead of dependence, everything changes. They listen more carefully. They respond more honestly. They allow the connection to unfold without forcing a specific outcome. Some conversations lead to strong relationships. Others simply remain pleasant interactions. Either result is acceptable, because the person's identity is not negotiating with the moment. Detached action creates this freedom. It allows experiences to develop naturally rather than under pressure. And this natural flow often produces stronger outcomes anyway. Now here is the coaching moment that brings this principle into everyday life. Adopt a mindset that quietly guides your actions. A mindset that removes emotional pressure while maintaining commitment. The mindset is simple. I move forward because it's who I am, not because I need a specific result. Notice how powerful this shift is. You are no longer acting to prove something. You are acting to express identity. A creator creates. An explorer explores. A learner learns. An innovator experiments. The behavior continues regardless of temporary outcomes because it reflects the person you are becoming. When this mindset becomes consistent, progress becomes far less stressful. You take action more easily. You adapt more quickly. You remain engaged longer. And over time, these qualities produce results that people driven by pressure rarely sustain. But detached action also creates another advantage. It improves your ability to notice opportunities. When the mind is fixated on forcing one specific outcome, it often overlooks alternative paths. It becomes narrow in its focus. It ignores subtle signals that could lead to better solutions. But when emotional pressure disappears, awareness expands. You begin seeing possibilities that once seemed invisible. You recognize patterns. You respond to unexpected developments with creativity instead of panic. This flexibility is one of the greatest strengths a person can develop, because life rarely unfolds exactly as planned. The ability to adapt calmly allows you to navigate complexity with intelligence rather than frustration. Detached action supports this adaptability. It creates space between the action you take and the meaning you assign to the result. That space gives you room to think, room to learn, room to evolve. And this ability to evolve is the foundation of long-term growth. Now imagine what happens when detached action becomes part of your identity. You wake up each day with the intention to move forward. You pursue meaningful goals. You take risks that once felt intimidating, but your emotional state remains steady. Success feels rewarding. Failure feels informative. Both experiences guide your development. And because your identity remains stable, you continue progressing regardless of temporary outcomes. This is the power of detached action. It transforms life from a series of tests into a series of explorations. It removes the tension that once slowed your progress. It replaces fear with curiosity. And curiosity opens the door to possibility. Now pause for a moment and reflect on how different life would feel if every step you took carried this energy. Imagine pursuing goals without constant anxiety about results. Imagine trying new approaches without fearing judgment. Imagine building momentum simply because action itself reflects who you are becoming. This is the freedom that detached action creates. It is not passive. It is not careless. It is deeply intentional. But the intention is focused on expression rather than validation. And when expression becomes the driving force behind action, growth becomes sustainable. Over time, this approach reshapes your relationship with success itself. You begin realizing that outcomes are not the ultimate source of fulfillment. They are milestones along a much larger journey. The real transformation happens in the way you think, act, and evolve along the way. And once that realization settles into your identity, the pressure surrounding achievement begins fading. You continue building. You continue exploring. You continue improving. But your sense of self no longer rises and falls with each result. Instead, it becomes anchored in something deeper. The process of living intentionally. And that realization opens the door to an even broader perspective on life. Because once you stop depending on outcomes for validation, something remarkable happens. Your entire relationship with achievement begins changing. You stop living as someone chasing success. You start living as someone expressing growth. And when that shift becomes permanent, life itself begins feeling lighter, clearer, and far more expansive. You've just discovered the power of detached action, a way of moving through life where effort remains strong but emotional pressure disappears. Action becomes exploration rather than evaluation. and each experience becomes information rather than judgment. But this shift leads to an even deeper transformation. Because once you stop tying your identity to outcomes, something unexpected begins to happen. Your entire relationship with success begins evolving. Achievement stops being the source of your identity. It becomes the natural byproduct of the way you live. And understanding this shift reveals one of the most liberating perspectives a person can experience. So now we move to the next step in this journey. Chapter 9. Living Beyond Outcome Dependency. For much of life, people unknowingly carry a quiet agreement with the world. An agreement that sounds something like this. If I achieve enough, then I will finally feel secure in who I am. If the career works out, then confidence will grow. If recognition arrives, then identity will feel validated. If goals are reached, then life will finally feel stable. At first, this agreement feels motivating. It encourages effort. It pushes people to improve. It inspires ambition. But hidden inside this agreement is a subtle trap. Because when identity becomes dependent on achievements, life begins to feel like a series of tests. Every goal becomes a measure of self-worth. Every setback begins to feel like a personal failure. Every moment of uncertainty carries emotional weight. And the mind quietly begins negotiating with outcomes. If this works, I will feel good about myself. If this fails, I will question who I am. This negotiation creates tension. It makes the future feel fragile. It causes the mind to constantly evaluate whether life is going according to plan. But something remarkable happens when this negotiation finally ends. Life becomes lighter. Not because ambition disappears, not because effort fades, but because identity is no longer attached to temporary results. When identity stands on its own foundation, achievements become experiences rather than verdicts. You still pursue meaningful goals. You still build, explore, and create. But your sense of self is no longer hanging in the balance each time something uncertain appears. This change transforms the way you move through life. Challenges feel less threatening. Opportunities feel less intimidating. Risks feel more manageable. Because the emotional consequences of failure lose their power. Failure becomes information. Success becomes feedback. Both experiences guide growth rather than defining identity. This shift is one of the most liberating transformations a person can experience. Because once identity stops negotiating with outcomes, freedom begins to appear. Freedom to try ideas without fear of judgment. Freedom to pursue meaningful work without constant pressure. Freedom to evolve without needing immediate validation. This freedom creates an entirely different relationship with ambition. Instead of chasing achievements in order to prove something, you begin pursuing them as expressions of who you are becoming. You build because building feels meaningful. You learn because learning feels energizing. You explore because curiosity leads you forward. Outcomes still matter, but they no longer determine your worth. And when this mindset settles into daily life, something interesting happens. The tension surrounding goals disappears. The mind becomes calmer. The body becomes more relaxed. And that calm energy allows you to perform more effectively anyway. It may sound paradoxical, but many people discover that their best results begin appearing only after they stop needing those results to validate their identity. This happens because emotional independence removes the pressure that once interfered with clear thinking. Imagine someone approaching a difficult challenge with the belief that their identity depends on success. Every decision carries emotional weight. Every mistake feels significant. The mind becomes cautious. Creativity shrinks. But when someone approaches the same challenge without attaching identity to the outcome, the experience feels different. The challenge becomes a puzzle to solve rather than a test to pass. This mindset encourages experimentation. It encourages persistence. It encourages learning. And these qualities often lead to stronger results over time. Now pause for a moment and consider a simple question. If failure did not define who you are, what would you attempt? What conversations would you initiate? What ideas would you explore? What opportunities would you pursue? Many people discover surprising answers when they reflect on this question honestly. They realize that certain dreams were not abandoned because they were impossible. They were abandoned because failure felt too personal. They realized that hesitation was not caused by lack of ability. It was caused by the fear of what failure might say about identity. But once identity stands independently from outcomes, these fears begin dissolving. You stop measuring yourself through external results. You start measuring yourself through alignment with the person you are becoming. This creates a powerful internal compass. Instead of asking, will this guarantee success? You begin asking, does this reflect who I want to become? That question produces a completely different set of decisions. It encourages authenticity. It encourages growth. It encourages experiences that expand your understanding of life. And when you live this way long enough, something fascinating begins to happen. Your identity becomes stable, not because you have achieved everything you ever wanted, but because you no longer require achievements to confirm your value. This stability creates emotional resilience. When success appears, you appreciate it without becoming dependent on it. When setbacks occur, you learn from them without losing your sense of self. This balanced perspective allows you to remain engaged with life for much longer than people who constantly chase validation. Because chasing validation is exhausting. It creates emotional highs and lows that drain energy over time. But living beyond outcome dependency creates steadiness. A steady sense of direction. A steady commitment to growth. A steady confidence that does not fluctuate with every temporary result. And this steadiness becomes one of the most powerful forces in personal transformation. It allows you to stay focused while others become discouraged. It allows you to adapt when circumstances change. It allows you to continue evolving even when progress feels slow. Because your identity is no longer negotiating with outcomes. It is grounded in something deeper. This is why we return to a phrase that captures the essence of this chapter. A phrase that represents the moment when pressure dissolves and freedom begins. Freedom appears the moment your identity stops negotiating with outcomes. Let those words settle. Freedom appears the moment your identity stops negotiating with outcomes. When this shift occurs, life becomes less about proving something to the world and more about participating fully in the process of growth. You still set goals. You still pursue excellence. But the emotional stakes change. Success becomes enjoyable rather than necessary. Failure becomes educational rather than threatening. And because your identity remains stable, you are free to explore possibilities without fear. This freedom often produces something unexpected. Clarity. Without the constant pressure of validation, your mind begins noticing what truly matters. You start recognizing which pursuits genuinely excite you and which ones were driven by external expectations. You begin designing a life that reflects your values rather than society's measurements of success. This clarity simplifies decision-making. It helps you focus your energy on meaningful directions. And over time, those directions begin producing results that feel deeply aligned with who you are. But something even more profound begins emerging as this perspective deepens. You start seeing life itself as a continuous process of becoming, not a race toward a final destination, not a competition for recognition, but a journey where growth, exploration, and self-expression create fulfillment along the way. This understanding removes the illusion that identity must be proven through achievements. Instead, identity becomes something you express through how you live each day, through curiosity, through creativity, through courage, through presence. And once you begin living from this place, the fear that once controlled your decisions gradually fades, because there is nothing left to prove. There is only life to experience and growth to embrace. But as this realization settles into your identity, another perspective begins appearing, a broader view of what it means to live intentionally. Because once you are free from outcome dependency, your attention naturally shifts toward something bigger. You begin thinking about the design of your life itself. Not just the goals you pursue, but the person you are becoming while pursuing them. And this perspective opens the door to a final expansion of everything you have learned. You've just explored what it means to live beyond outcome dependency, a state where achievements no longer determine your identity and life begins feeling lighter, clearer, and more expansive. Because once your identity stops negotiating with outcomes, freedom appears. Freedom to explore. Freedom to grow. Freedom to live with intention rather than pressure. But this freedom naturally leads to a bigger question. If your identity is no longer controlled by results, what kind of life do you truly want to design? What kind of thinker do you want to become? What kind of presence do you want to bring into the world? Answering those questions takes us to the final chapter of this journey. A chapter about stepping fully into the person life begins responding to. Chapter 10. Becoming the person life responds to. Everything you have learned so far leads to this moment. The journey through desire, emotional independence, identity upgrades, detached action, and living beyond outcome dependency all converge here. Because the ultimate truth is simple. Life is a mirror. It reflects the internal state you carry. Not your possessions, not your titles, not your achievements, but the energy you bring into every interaction, every decision, every moment of your life. People who consistently attract opportunity, connection, and meaningful experiences are not doing so because they are trying harder than anyone else. They do not manipulate situations. They do not chase validation. Instead, they cultivate an internal alignment that naturally radiates outward. This alignment begins with emotional freedom. The freedom to act without needing each step to validate identity. It continues with consistent identity reinforcement, living as the person you are becoming rather than the person you once believed you must remain. It deepens with detached action, engaging with life fully while removing pressure from every move. And it blossoms into a perspective where achievements are not the source of your value, but the natural byproduct of your internal state. When these elements integrate, a remarkable shift occurs. Opportunities appear that previously seemed unreachable. People respond differently to your presence. Challenges feel manageable rather than threatening. The external world begins to match your internal reality. And here is the subtle philosophical point most people overlook. The universe does not reward effort alone. It responds to the energy of your identity. Your thoughts, feelings, and habitual patterns create a frequency that life mirrors back to you in experiences, circumstances, and relationships. When you are caught chasing validation, that frequency is inconsistent. Life responds with resistance, delays, or friction. When you live with integrity, calm energy, and authentic expression, the frequency aligns. Life begins to flow. Opportunities that match your internal state start appearing naturally. Pause for a moment and reflect on this. When you stop chasing the approval of others, when you stop attempting to prove your worth through results, what kind of energy do you radiate? What opportunities become visible when your internal state no longer negotiates with outcomes? This is the essence of becoming the person life responds to. It is a process of integration, not a single step, not a quick fix. It begins with the subtle shifts you practiced in earlier chapters, observing desire without attachment, upgrading identity before pursuing results, moving with calm, and detaching from outcome dependency. Over time, these shifts compound. They strengthen. They create momentum that cannot be stopped. The life you desire is no longer something you chase. It is something you embody. When internal alignment becomes your foundation, external circumstances begin reflecting that alignment automatically. Success is no longer a desperate pursuit. It becomes a natural consequence of living intentionally. And here is the final realization, the phrase that encapsulates the secret of all chapters. When you stop chasing validation, you start attracting opportunity. Repeat it slowly. Let it sink in. When you stop chasing validation, you start attracting opportunity. When this principle settles into your daily life, every decision, every interaction, every action carries a different energy. You respond rather than react. You create rather than chase. You express rather than prove. And in that state, life begins to feel effortless. Not because effort has disappeared, but because every action is aligned with the identity you reinforce and the frequency you maintain. This is the ultimate freedom, the ability to live without attachment to outcomes, while producing results that previously felt impossible. It is the quiet power that transforms ordinary moments into extraordinary results. It is the culmination of emotional independence, identity mastery, detached action, and freedom from outcome dependency. And it is available to anyone willing to follow the journey inward before expecting transformation outward. Life responds to the energy you carry. You are no longer negotiating with outcomes. You are no longer performing for approval. You are no longer chasing results to validate your worth. You are simply becoming the person life responds to. And in that becoming, everything you have practiced begins working for you naturally, effortlessly, and powerfully. You've reached the final chapter, but this is not the end. It is the beginning of a life lived intentionally, aligned internally, and expressed authentically. Your challenge now is simple, yet profound. Live each day as the person whose identity quietly directs every choice. Move without attachment, act with calm energy, upgrade identity before pursuing results, and embody the frequency that attracts opportunity. Because the moment you commit to this, life stops being a negotiation. It starts being a reflection, and the reflection will be exactly the one you've learned to cultivate. Step fully into this version of yourself starting today, and notice how the world begins responding differently. Because you are no longer chasing validation, you are creating presence. In closing, for most of your life, you were probably told that success comes from wanting something badly enough, from pushing harder, from caring more, from proving something to the world. But now you've seen a deeper truth. The people who move through life with the greatest clarity, confidence, and opportunity are rarely driven by desperation. They are driven by identity. They pursue their goals with energy. But they are not emotionally dependent on the outcome. They take action. But their self-worth is not negotiating with results. They move forward with curiosity instead of pressure. And because of that, their presence becomes calm. Their thinking becomes clear. Their decisions become stronger. And slowly, almost quietly, life begins responding differently to them. Because the moment you stop needing validation from the outcome, you begin acting like someone who already believes in their own direction. And that belief changes everything. It changes how you walk into rooms. It changes how you approach opportunities. It changes the risks you're willing to take. And most importantly, it changes the identity you reinforce every single day. So here is the challenge I want you to take with you after finishing this audiobook. For the next 7 days, pursue your goals with full effort, but remove the emotional pressure from the outcome. Approach your actions with curiosity instead of desperation. Notice when your mind tries to attach your identity to results, and simply observe it, because the moment you notice that pattern, you begin weakening it, and the moment you stop needing the outcome, you begin stepping into the frequency that attracts it. So move forward with focus. Move forward with calm energy. Move forward with the quiet confidence of someone who understands something powerful. Your life will always begin aligning with the identity you choose to embody. And the moment you stop chasing validation, you start becoming the person life naturally responds to. Now the only question left is this: who will you decide to become next?